All right. So because of AP and other occurrences, we won't be talking about the precedences in class, because otherwise we won't have enough time. But we're going to get this through a video, so I hope you guys enjoy this. So let us start with the Greek and Etruscan precedences in Roman temple construction. So first off, I'd like to point out that a lot of people like to think of Rome in isolation from everywhere, and that is just not true. You know, no man's an island, unless of course you're Simon and Garfunkel, in which case then you're a rock. But the Mediterranean is a huge web of interconnectivity. There's actually a book called The Corrupted Sea that was just published talking about all of this interconnectivity through there. You can think of the Mediterranean as an internet for the ancients, where ships are traveling all the place and ideas are traveling all the time. So groups are not as isolated as as people want you to think. So with that in mind, we move to the Greek islands and where we start to see monumental temples really early on. We start to see, so the Greeks are the first group to start doing monumental temples in the West, and they do it in about the 8th century BCE. However, this is in the West. In the East, they've been doing monumental temples for thousands of years at this point, through the Mesopotamian and Egyptian empires. This is a picture from the Met Art Museum. It's the Temple of Isis. While this rendition of the temple is Augustan in age, it has earlier precedences. So it just shows you that the Egyptians are doing this type of monumental construction well before the Greeks start doing it. And it seems that the Egyptians and the Mesopotamian empires like the Babylonians and the Assyrians have influence on what the Greeks decide to build. The first monumental temples we really see is the Temple of Hera on Samos. It's this top one here. It was built around 800 BCE. The bottom one is a later rendition of it, built around 650 BCE. But the top one is the one we're focusing on. It was built out of thatch, wood timber, and mud bricks. And that's why they have this column down the middle, because it's there to support a roof. Eventually, the wood, thatch, and mud brick leads into marble. But like I said, at the beginning, it's a lot of these perishable materials, which is why we don't have a lot of these early temples. It seems to be connected to a structure called the megaron, which, as I've nicely defined for us up here, is the Mycenaean throne room. And it comes up with a couple of different parts. We have the porch, with typically columns into it, leading into the hearth area right here, which also is surrounded by columns. And then at the end, although this one's shown it at the side, there's the king. And you just replace king with god, and you have a temple. This is just a standard plan. This is a picture from the Megaron at Mycenae, where King Agamemnon ruled. So we have these early Megaron-like structures that lead way into the canonical styles that we get. And there's 3 canonical styles: the Doric, Ionic, and the Corinthian. So we have a Doric here, which is the cone-shaped capital, the Ionic, which has these scrolls or volutes, and then the Corinthian, which is this flowery plant-like one. So we have these 3 canonical column styles, which lead to also certain types of structures being built on the temple when you have these styles. Well, we'll get into that. The Doric is typically found on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. The reason it's called Doric is because it's built in the area where the Doric language was used. The Ionic was typically found over in Turkey or Asia Minor, in the Ionian Islands. It's again named on the language. The Corinthian seems to have connections with the acanthus flower, but it doesn't necessarily have connections with Corinth, as you would think. It's more of an enigmatic structure, the Corinthian. So let's start with the Doric. Scholars believe that it is petrified timbers. So the different structures seem to have been representative of what a timber structure would have looked like. And here we have what they think the timbers would have looked like. So these are the beams coming across with the rafters here across with these headers going between the different columns. And these structures are supposed to protect the wood elements from the weather. The earliest one we know of that was Doric in the typical style was the Temple of Apollo at Thermon, roughly around 630 BCE. Although we get the pinnacle of Doric temples at the Temple of Aphaia on Aegina, which is an island, around 500. Now the Doric is known for having three things. It has a triglyph, which is these structures that have three prongs on them, hence tri. The metope, which is typically a blank panel, although sometimes it can have sculptural decorations. And then the column without a base. All right, so the column with its cone-like structure where there is no base. And so, yes, we have the Proto-Doric Entablature, and then here is the Temple of Aphaia in all of its glory. And you can see the triglyphs here and the metopes. And so the triglyphs were supposed to be the end of beams, and the metopes are kind of space in between. And then you get the columns with the cone-like structure and no base down there. And then most Greek temples have 3 steps. On the other side, we have the Ionic temples. The earliest we think was around 570 BCE on the island of Samos, although we can't really confirm, we aren't really sure about that. People are discovering new stuff all the time. One of the best examples is the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Alas, this is what it looked like in all of its glory. This is what it is nowadays. It's sad. But they're talking about reconstructing it now and draining the swamp. But to talk about the Ionic temples, while they have this pedimental structure up here, the main thing is they have a continuous frieze, which is very decorated, usually highly decorated with sculpture. And then they have the capital with the volutes, the curves, and a column that is resting on a base. So we go through this again, sad. But, like I said, these last 2 patterns that we've gone through are just that, patterns of typical use. This is a picture of the Periclean Acropolis, taken from the Pnyx, and the Periclean Acropolis is wrought with structures that don't follow the typical pattern. We'll start with the Parthenon, the temple to Athena Parthenos, completed around 438 BCE. While it is Doric on the outside, you have triglyphs here and lovely decorated metopes with different. Here we have the Centauromachy, the Battle of the Centaurs. Then there's the Amazomachy, the Trojan War, and the Battle of the Giants, the Gigantomachy. Decorate the metopes. On the inside, which is just out of sight here, right here in between, we have an Ionic frieze. And then, what's even more, some scholars think there may have been Corinthian columns on the inside. So they've already broken with canon, and they have all these elements mixed in together. Here we'll show you here the different elements. So here were the Doric columns. Here are another set of Doric columns. Here were Ionic. The statue of Athena was supposed to be right here. And then back here, they're either very tall Ionic columns or Corinthian columns. So while we had those nice patterns before, where the Doric had the metopes and the triglyphs and columns with no bases, and the Ionics has the frieze with a column on a base, it's already kind of going fallen apart, even in the height of what is supposed to be Greek architecture. The Erechtheion, which was either completed in 421 or 406. There's a scholar, Michael Vickers, who's very intelligent and very smart, but he's kind of throwing everything out and saying, asking us to question our basic judgments. He kind of thinks it's the later date. Traditional scholars think it's the earlier date. It all depends on how you read a text. But the Erechtheion is like a whole smorgasbord of column temple structures. We have Ionic here, more Ionic here and here, and then we have this porch on the south side of women, of caryatids. And to boot, this shape's not even traditional. It's not this traditional rectangle shape you see. Here's the porch, this is where the caryatids are. It's all over the place, and you have different structures going everywhere. So I show this to, not to show you what the Romans are thinking and what they're drawing from. The Romans are definitely drawn from Ionic columns, but to show you that the patterns aren't all set in stone. It's punny, I know. They're not all set in stone. They are definitely very malleable, and architects can take and get rid of what they want. We're going to talk now, we're going to move and end, well, almost end, about talking about the Greeks with the Temple of Apollo at Bassae, which is out in the Peloponnesian countryside. And this is around 400 BCE, and this is what we think is the first use of a Corinthian column in a temple structure. So we have these Ionic columns, an Ionic frieze up along the top, and it shows an Amazonaki, so the Battle of the Amazons. And then all the way at the end, it has evidence of one, possibly three, different Corinthian columns. Where the Corinthian column came from, we're not really sure. Some people say it was people trying to deal with the fact that Ionic columns didn't make good corners, although that's not always the case. Some people say it was because it's connected to a mythology where in Corinth, the acanthus plant grew at grave markers, which were columns, and so it looked like this acanthus plant was growing around this column, and that's where somebody was inspired. We're not really sure, but wherever it comes from, in 400, it is definitely in use, and the Corinthian column becomes one of the most widely used columns of the Romans. We see major Greek influence in Rome after the 2nd century BCE. So this is the Temple of Jupiter Stator, just outside the Roman Forum, and it was built and completed in 146 BCE. Why, you might ask? Well, because the Romans just conquered and finally subdued all the Greek cities at this time. And so at this time there was an influx of Greek slaves being brought into Rome, and so they were able to use the Greek slaves to design these buildings for their own uses. Although, as we're going to find out, it's not just a Greek building being built in Rome, it's a medley of influences being put together. So I'm going to stop the video here so that I can upload this, and then we'll start with the Etruscan ones.